Hello, folks. Welcome to Scratch the Surface. My name's EJ Scott. Today, my guest is Ryan Suffern. Ryan Suffern is a director of documentary, mostly documentary films. He works for the Kennedy Marshall Company, and mostly for Frank Marshall. But he also helped make my documentary called Running Blind. I'll talk about that in a minute, and I'll talk about what we talked about also in a minute. But first, let me give myself a plug. Follow me on the Twitter at EJ Scott and at EJ Podcast for the podcast. And I have a website, ejscott.com. Instagram, EJScott1106. I'm raising money for charity. Go to crowdrise.com/7on7. And there's about a dozen or so very good charities to donate to. Please do. I'm doing eBay auctions right now. Raising money this month in April, raising money for Autism Society of America. But I'm raising money for lots of different good charities and always doing eBay auctions and raffles and stuff like that, of sometimes just stuff like my used CD or DVD to a cast signed poster of Daredevil or True Blood or something like that. So check that out, and anything in between, really. And also there's a documentary that I just mentioned called Running Blind, and it is available on iTunes, Google Play, and Amazon. And you can buy a digital copy for just $2 or $3. And it's a 30-minute documentary short that's well worth your time and money if you check it out. It is about me running 12 marathons in 12 states in 12 months in 2012. And because I am losing my eyesight to an eye disease called choroideremia. And it runs in my family, so I'm legally blind right now. And I ran blindfolded in 2012 because my eyes are sensitive to the sun. And so that's why I did that. And I raised a bunch of money that year. And it's really a good film. I hope you give it a shot and check it out. It's not a lot of time and not a lot of money if you do. So low risk, high reward, I think is what they say. And Ryan helped me make that documentary. And we talk a bit about that, but we talk a lot about his new documentary called Finding Oscar, which is coming to a lot of theaters on the 21st of April. So if you get a chance, it'd be well worth checking out. I just watched it the other day at a screening here in Los Angeles, and it was really impactful, and I learned a lot about these events that happened in Guatemala in the 80s. So we talk a lot about that in the documentary. In the podcast, and we talk about a lot of stuff. He was an assistant on movie sets for Steven Spielberg. We talk about that, and we talk about his interaction with some of the actors. We talk about a lot of good stuff. So I hope you will sit back and enjoy my talk with Ryan Suffern from April 15th, 2017. Hi, Ryan.
Are we on here, EJ?
Yeah.
Hi, EJ.
How's it going?
I'm good. Good to be here.
Thanks for being here. We go back a ways.
We do.
We go back a ways. We go back. Your wife is an improviser, who I know very well from the improv days of old. Anyway.
They're old days for all of us now.
Yeah, I know. And I guess, and you took classes there too at IO West, right?
Not IO West. We both.
Oh, you did Chicago,
both did
right?
Chicago, and so we both did all of the 5 levels, and then as well as performed on house teams there.
Right. And when did you guys move to Chicago? L.A.
So I moved from Chicago to LA first in the summer of 2002. So literally almost 15 years ago.
Okay.
In a few months.
Yeah.
And then Kim came out a few months later in the fall of 2002.
And you guys were together.
We were together.
Right.
I proposed to her before she moved out here. Made it real.
Oh, within those months?
Yeah, and then we got married after living here for about a year.
Oh, okay. And how long were you together? Were you on a team together or something?
No. We actually met. We were both English majors at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. So we met at the tail end of college. Both moved into the city of Chicago, and for different reasons, we had both wanted to check out improv.
Oh, okay.
Kim knew that she had aspirations to act, and had been encouraged by, people knowing that she wanted to possibly do that it would be good for her to, work on her skill set, so to speak, and take some improv classes, especially somebody who's naturally very funny.
Yeah.
In college, I remember seeing an improv troupe at the Union on campus do this long form show. And I was just like, what is this? And I was so impressed. These were friends of mine that were just making this whole room laugh, instantaneously. And I was like, how did you guys learn how to do this? And they had taken some sort of workshop at IO in Chicago. So when we moved into the city, we were like, we got to check this place out. And we ended up both living in Wrigleyville, like just a couple blocks from the theater. Mm-hmm. So we took the classes together, all 5 rounds of them. She got placed on a team, of course, like after, one session. I think I had to wait till the near the end to get placed on my first team. And I got placed on, I think, one of the best names of an improv team that I've ever heard, which was Bob from Accounting. Which I did one rehearsal with them, and then they broke up Bob from Accounting, so I never even got to perform with them. Yeah,
that's funny.
So it was okay. So
it was one of those things where it's like a team's been going, and then you get placed on.
Yeah, and you try not to take that personally. But then we actually got placed on the same team. Oh. We were on a team called Garbage, and did that. I guess I was maybe on the team for about a year. Some really funny people. Emily Wilson was on it. Kim, of course. Sean Monahan.
Oh, Sean.
But I started doing set production assistant work on some independent films. Mm-hmm. And that started to just really consume my time and made it difficult to find time to rehearse, find time to perform when you're working 14, 16-hour days.
When things change, priorities change.
Yeah.
That's the thing with improv. Like, when I started doing it and really getting into it, the number one priority was improv. Mm-hmm. And that's how it is for a lot of people when you're first getting into it. And then once you're in it for a while, then you start noticing other things start taking priority, whether it's a job or family or just whatever.
Hobby or whatever. It's addictive, right? I mean, in many ways, and it's addictive in the actual act of performing improv and making an entire room full of people laugh on the spot is an endorphin release that's comparable to taking drugs.
Yeah.
And that's addictive, but it also becomes your world. It's a subculture of people who just hang out at the theater. So it's your entertainment. It's your aspirations of what you want to do for work, and maybe you actually do work because you teach it or things of that nature.
And it's a subculture of other addictions like drinking.
It's perfect. It's like, hey, drugs and drinking and cigarettes, they all work really great here, and shitty food and right next door, and so it's probably not like most addictions, the most healthy, sustainable life, but for a period of time, it can be a lot of fun.
Yeah. So are you from Chicago originally?
Chicagoland area, northwest suburbs.
Born and raised?
Mm-hmm. Bartlett. My parents lived in Streamwood, and it turns out that Kim and I were actually born in the same hospital, which...
Oh, really?
Is just kind of crazy. Her folks, she grew up in Elk Grove Village, but we didn't meet each other
You didn't meet each other in the
until
hospitals?
we were 3. Well, she's a year older than me, so that would have been weird. But yeah, so we didn't meet until we were a few hours away down at Urbana-Champaign. But it just so happens our folks are 15 minutes apart in the suburbs,
Right.
which cuts both ways now when we go back to visit, because it's very convenient that our families are so close together. But then it's also like every second that you're back, you want to be with one family or the other, as opposed to we're going to spend, we're going to go to Cleveland to see your family, and we'll for Christmas, and we'll go to Chicago to see my family for Thanksgiving.
Alternate
exactly,
years
that
or
kind
any
of
that
stuff.
stuff. Right. Make it more relaxing.
Yes.
But you can't do that.
Yeah. A lot of driving back and forth between on the Elgin O'Hare Expressway when we go.
Deborah and I took, mostly me, but I took the holidays off from New York because both our families are in New York. And I was like, we easily could have been in New York for the holidays, and I chose to come back to LA right before Christmas and stay here for Christmas and New Year's.
We've done that now the last 2 years because we had Iris. Yeah. We have 2 daughters, and Iris is our youngest, who last year was only a few months old around the holidays, so that was the perfect excuse not to travel to the frozen tundra of the Midwest. And this year around, it was like, that was kind of great. Yeah. Like, maybe we could do that again. Yeah. So we do live in a pretty beautiful place, and you'd like to think the people in New York or Chicago would really want to come here and visit us, right?
Yeah.
And get away from that.
But traveling itself is just
stressful. It's expensive around the holidays, and it's really stressful once you got a couple kids that you're slugging around.
How are those girls doing? They're so cute.
Yeah,
Pearl and Iris.
Pearl is 5. Iris is a little over 1.5, and they're doing great. I mean, Iris is now out of that kind of just a baby blob thing. Right. She's really got a full-blown personality, and she's very mobile and talkative, even though she can only say a few kind of single syllables. She can communicate a lot through those syllables. Yeah. So it's a lot of fun. I mean, I remember this stage with Pearl, and as a dad, you don't have the physiological kind of biological connection with your child for obvious reasons. And so it takes, I think, a while to really form a genuine relationship. And once your child can kind of not just recognize you, but like really, want to interact with you and knows who you are, misses you, communicates to you, that's when it really starts to get fun.
Oh man.
Yeah, so it's fun, but it's it's also definitely challenging because we don't have any family out here. Yeah. And so every time I go away, whether it's on production or to a film festival or things of that nature, it means I'm leaving Kim with the 2 little ones.
It's gonna be hard.
It's a challenge. It means I try to go away for the bare minimum of time. So it becomes a stress for all of us. But at the same time, it is a good problem to have. We've got 2 beautiful children, and I've got a lot keeping me busy these days. So that's been great.
That's good. Yeah, I saw on your Facebook you were like, I've traveled like 18 times in a few months or something like that.
Yeah, well, last fall, so we premiered Finding Oscar, this documentary, at the Telluride Film Festival in September, Labor Day weekend. And I think it's played 15 film festivals since then, and I've gone to 11 of those film festivals. So it's been a lot of flights. I'm really glad I got my TSA pre-check right before. That has been.
How do you do that?
It's really easy. Like you can go online, you can sign up, make an appointment. You have to go to a place to get interviewed, essentially get vetted. Right. It didn't feel very extreme, but but you don't even have to go to the airport. Like I always thought you had to go to the airport, which just sounded like that's the last place I ever want to go if I don't need to be going there.
Just for fun.
Yeah, but like I just went to this little outpost, and I think in Glendale, I was in and out like 10 minutes. And,
really?
And now you can, having just flown back from New York last week on a Saturday, and that line for the proletariat of having to like wait to get through security, and it's like swoop, it's worth it. It's like $80 too for 5 years.
Oh, I see.
So
I get to do that because of my cane.
There you go. That's not. Do you go to the pre-check? Is that where they send you then, or where do they send you?
I just go and I check, and I just somebody comes and gets me and walks me through security and brings me to my gate and all that stuff.
Nice.
Yeah, it's nice.
Silver linings.
I guess, right? I guess.
If you're gonna go blind, at least have something to show for
Let
it.
me cut some lines.
Yeah, there you go.
Well,
how are you doing, man?
I'm okay. It's good to be back in LA. I was having a hard time in New York.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard.
I would think New York would be kind of overwhelming, just
It is.
in a sensational thing. Yeah.
That way, and I just think Deb and I have been here too long. We're just kind of spoiled by a more relaxed environment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just more. You know, we have a nice house here, and there we have to rent a small 1-bedroom apartment, and that's hard for the dog, and that's hard for us, and we're close to way too many family members, and so it gets
Not to name any names.
Oh, all of them.
They don't listen to this, right?
They're probably not. So it gets, it could get stressful sometimes, especially for me. It gets really stressful. Is that your phone or my phone?
It's mine.
Let me do this too. You're blowing up.
No,
I know you're busy.
Group text from improvisers making jokes.
Good old bits. You want to
Yeah.
read some bits on your text?
I don't even know how to turn it off. Anyway.
I do airplane mode, if you can.
There we
stand
go.
it.
All right. Well,
But,
while I'm putting my phone on airplane mode.
So how are you feeling with the idea that we're going to be blown up by North Korea? Are you...
My wife is much more worried about that than I am.
Yeah.
I just don't know if I'm allowing myself to I've got a lot of stuff percolating in the deep dark recesses of my mind.
Uh-huh. This probably won't even get out by then.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the turnaround is on these things. You might want to let's fast track it, Last words.
Hey, we're big Kim Jong-un fans here.
That we pronoun is reserved to EJ. He likes to talk about himself in the third person plural. Yeah, no, I mean, listen, I've been making a film about a genocide for the last 3 years, so
kidding.
I've got, I'm all too aware of how awful we can be as human beings to each other, and I'm not an optimist when it comes to this stuff. I'd like to think with North Korea specifically that it won't come to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to think that too.
Especially since we're probably the closest target in Los Angeles, major target to, across the Pacific. But I also really, no one saw any of this coming.
Yeah.
Even if the writing was on the wall in one way or another. So, yeah, I think it's a good age for dark comedy.
Yeah, real dark.
Because we all need to laugh, I think, on some level, or else you just go crazy.
Yeah. Then maybe they could laugh more over in North Korea. Wouldn't
Yeah,
that be
maybe
nice?
they are laughing. Who knows?
Oh boy,
They had quite a parade today.
Did they?
Yeah, they. So this was the whatever anniversary something centennial something birthday. I don't follow it close enough to know, but I know that this was why they were worried that they were going to test something, and they just did another one of their big military marches, and apparently showcased that they've got warheads that they can launch from submarines, in theory, and long range missiles and things like that.
Are they showing off theirs because we showed off ours?
I think they do this. This is what they do.
Yeah.
But I think they're doing it with a little added extra flavor this time around.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, not to get into geopolitics, but
let's go.
But yeah, let's go geopolitics. It looks like. I mean, who's more erratic, Kim Jong Un or Donald Trump? Who's more predictable at this point?
Oh God, they're both predictably unpredictable.
I guess so.
Especially Donald Trump. I mean, he's been in office like a couple months, and he's like, "Let's fire some missiles. Let's do it."
Of course, best thing that seemingly happened for him, and
he's been in politics for 2.5 months. He's like, all right.
But you know what? And I guess in his defense, which you'll not often hear me say, all presidents like to play with their militaries.
Yeah.
We're shooting at shit all over the world. You know, we just usually don't pay that close attention to it.
Yeah.
And certainly, Obama did as much, and we know George W. Bush started a couple wars, and H.W. Bush did that whole thing in Kuwait and Iraq, and I think you got to go back to Carter. I don't know if Carter actually used the military. I think he might be the last, maybe even only president of modern age to not engage. But I'm also just showing my ignorance of who was president when
that would sound right.
When I was born.
He's a super peaceful type.
Super
of
peaceful.
person.
Yeah. Not. I know only of his legacy in that respect. In that they cut off aid to many of the countries where there was human rights abuses happening, including Guatemala. So just the fact that they wouldn't even give money to countries where where bad things were happening, I think speaks volumes to kind of if there was a Carter doctrine,
Right. And we'll talk about the Finding Oscar. Well, how'd you get into Finding Oscar? Because I was at the screening the other day, and it was a great movie.
Thank you.
Obviously tragic subject matter, but surprisingly, spoiler alert, it's got a nice ending.
Yeah, I would have been hard pressed to be attracted to telling that story if I didn't know it had a good ending to start.
And you and I in the Q&A, you mentioned that you were present at the last, what you thought was the last scene or the last bit of this story. So
yeah,
you kind of worked backwards.
Absolutely. No, the very first day of filming was the last scene of the film, and I knew it at the time. And I don't. It's not a huge spoiler alert to talk about it, but essentially, I got introduced to this story because I work with Frank Marshall, who is incredibly successful Hollywood producer for many, many years, and I've worked with him for several years, including he was our executive producer on Running Blind, which we'll have to talk about in more detail. And I head up the documentary division for the Kennedy Marshall Company, which Frank started with his wife, Kathleen Kennedy, who's now busy producing Star Wars movies and
never heard of it.
Running Lucasfilm. Yeah, they're quite a successful.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Who's more successful? Is anybody more successful than this?
As a married couple in this industry, I don't think so. Right? Just 2015 is ridiculous in the sense that Jurassic World came out, became
huge,
the third largest grossing box office internationally, and then it got moved to 4 when Star Wars came out and became number 3 in the same year. That's just that's silly.
So they're having a comeback. Which is good.
I don't think they ever went anywhere. But yeah, they're doing quite well for themselves, and more power to them. Especially because I get to work with them.
That's cool.
Frank especially. And so Frank literally came into my office one day and just said, "You got to hear this story." And so.
Oh, so he turned you on to it.
He turned me on to it because his connection to it was that he went to high school and is lifelong friends with this human rights attorney named Scott Greathead. And Scott ended up taking on Oscar's case because Oscar Ramirez was here living undocumented and being the subject of this epic search that started in Guatemala. So Oscar was coming out to Riverside, California, with Scott and this forensic anthropologist, Freddie Pecciarelli, because they found one of these soldiers living as a U.S. citizen in Southern California. And Oscar was going there to read a prepared victim statement. And so I took my camera, spent the day with these 3 guys, and I came home to Kim that night, and I was like, I think I've filmed the end to the most fascinating story I've ever heard. And now I have to go get the the rest of it. And
And
I'm
so-
going to have to go to Guatemala to go get
When
it.
Frank told you to go film that, what was the idea of getting that on film? Just to have it?
Just felt like something meaningful,
Yeah.
because
Not that it would lead to anything, but just to have it.
it just felt like there might be something here.
Yeah.
So there had been multiple iterations of the telling of this story, both in a really long form piece of journalism from ProPublica, as well as This American Life did a radio piece, and collectively they won a Peabody, and this all happened before we got involved. So as we got vested in this story, it became quite clear to us that there was something very interesting here, that as a story that had worked already in print and in radio. And to just explain the story better, Finding Oscar is the story of this guy, Oscar Ramirez, who is living outside of Boston, Massachusetts, in Framingham, and he's 32 years old. He's got a young family. He's undocumented. And he gets a phone call out of the blue one day from a special prosecutor in Guatemala saying, "You don't know me, but I've been looking for you, if you are who I think you are, for nearly 2 decades, because I think you're one of the lone survivors of this massacre that took place in Guatemala, where the Guatemalan military wiped out an entire community, this village of Doceres."
And just that village was a couple hundred people or something, right?
Yeah, roughly
But-
200 people.
But the massacre that kept occurring all over the country was like hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, well, so we focus on this single massacre because there's these two young boys were abducted. They were spared. Everybody else was slaughtered. And 2 boys were abducted and taken by 2 of the soldiers involved. And so this search started to find them, and to find Oscar became the linchpin, because he was much more difficult to find, in that he had left the country by the time they were trying to find him. So that's why it took so long to find this needle in the haystack, which is, in the suburbs of Boston, of all places. But the special prosecutor says, if you are who we think you are, you would be the living proof to try to hold these soldiers accountable. And that includes the person you think is your father figure is actually, one of the commanders of this special forces troop that helped, killed your entire family and community. So it's the definition of an existential kind of crisis moment, to have your whole life revealed as essentially a lie. And yet we juxtapose that against this heroic search by these activists and anthropologists and special prosecutors in Guatemala, as they're searching for truth, not just in this massacre, but in, as you said, hundreds of massacres that just like it that took place in Guatemala. Guatemala suffered a 36-year-long internal conflict, like civil war, where the Guatemalan military and government were fighting the, what had been labeled the communist guerrillas. But in the midst of that fight, that conflict, a genocide took place, primarily in the late 70s and early 80s, where there was this real scorched earth campaign where they were just wiping out entire communities, many of them indigenous Mayan communities, though the village of Doceres wasn't.
And what was the point of it? Was it just a dictatorship of like, well, we just want our people who will listen to us and follow us around, and that's like, why are they killing all these children? And
so I've learned a lot about this. I come from improv backgrounds, and so this is not like my normal sandbox, so to speak. Even as a storyteller that I've been engaged with a handful of, I would, say that they're human rights centric.
In Guatemala.
There's probably some improv, but it's not in our story. Not too many laugh lines, but the ones we do have play pretty well, if you can imagine. But yeah, it's what I've learned in this education, not just of Guatemala, but throughout the region, and this idea of genocide, I think it's often hard to answer why do genocides happen in the sense of like, what is their function? I think what is often commonplace is that they happen because you have a group that is in power that goes out of its way to deem a populace of people, depending upon their ethnicity, depending upon where they live, who they worship, whatever it is, but somehow they deem them an other, and in making them an other, they are able to strip their humanity away from them so that, ultimately other human beings can do horrendous things to them, whether it's, wiping out entire communities by bashing their heads in with sledgehammers, or, bringing them into concentration camps and ultimately gassing them in, as we saw in the Holocaust. There's so many. I mean, it's devastating how many iterations there are in between this. But I think for me, I grew up with the idea of the term genocide felt like a history book term, or it felt like something that happened like maybe in Africa or in Asia, but like far away or long ago. And yet here's a story of a genocide that took place in our lifetimes, very close to us geographically, as well as with our own government's participation in supporting the wrong side in this conflict, in the sense that they were supporting the Guatemalan government and military when these known human rights abuses were taking place. So in telling Oscar's story and this incredible, search for truth and justice in a place where there are still large swaths of the society that don't know this even happened, much less acknowledge this, it's a lot like The Act of Killing. I don't know if you've seen that documentary, but it's about similar horrific things that happened in Indonesia, and yet the perpetrators are still in power, and so there are many in Guatemala who are seeking just an acknowledgement of this truth. And so for this story in particular, Oscar, and finding Oscar in this case that they're able to build for this one massacre represents a much larger story and a larger search for the truth. And so my attraction in telling it was that we could focus on this very specific, independent, and intimate and personal story, but we wouldn't be able to tell it without giving the context to a larger story that touches upon issues like U.S. foreign policy and immigration and a genocide in the Americas. But hopefully do so in a compelling way, really trying to, look to some of the aspects of this kind of true crime mystery detective tale, Well,
it was so funny watching it, even just, I don't know how many, 3 days ago or whatever it was, and just going, oh my God, because the whole Putin thing that went on a couple weeks ago, it just felt very... I mean, your story takes place in the 80s, but it's still taking place, Like it's just repetition.
Yeah, and that's at the heart of it, right? If we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it, And a big part of why we were engaged in the ways that we were engaged in Central and Latin America in the late 70s and 80s was because we were fighting this Cold War with Russia, with the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And so we had these proxy battles, not unlike what's happening now in Syria, And if we're fighting communists and somebody else is fighting communists, now the enemy of our enemy is our ally, and we're supporting really bad, regimes, even democratically elected governments that we help to topple because they seem to be, sympathetic to an ideology that we don't like. That's where you see, I think, when you step back and you look at our government's role in disrupting and creating a lot of these pockets of that become, these spaces where horrific things happen to people. We have accountability in that, and I think we as citizens have accountability to better understand the actions of our government, even if we're not immediately aware or implicated because we didn't make these decisions directly. We allow these people to run our government. And this isn't unique to Republicans or Democrats. This is throughout our history, but certainly Reagan going to Central America 2 days before this particular massacre takes place and vouching for Rios Montt, the dictator of Guatemala at that time, who took over in a military coup and was responsible for many of these massacres taking place under his reign and his authority. And here's Reagan, our president, saying to the world, this guy's a defender of democracy, and has our full support.
Do you think he did that to try to avoid further violence with between United States and Guatemala? Or
no,
just
there
to
really wasn't a threat of that. I think, to get back to your question of why do these things happen, there are often reasons behind wanting to wipe out populations. Oftentimes it can be those populations are on or near natural resources that you want, or
right.
a land grab. Right. If you really are looking to demoralize your enemy and you can't locate them directly, you try to wipe out anyone who seems sympathetic to your enemy. So if they were fighting these guerrillas who were hiding in the rural areas of the country, you just wipe the face of the earth of any of those communities as a way to try to eradicate them. Now, it's hard to make that argument when at this time in this decades-long conflict, the guerrillas weren't really seemingly that much of a threat, and yet they continued to carry out this horrific violence throughout the countryside. So that would seem to imply that there are ulterior motives other than just using this tactic to win some sort of conflict. But to get back to your point, all of that is overwhelmingly devastating and harrowing and horrific. And if it wasn't for the fact that I knew from the first day of filming that not only did they find Oscar and that Oscar now is participating in this same justice that has led to, it took decades of searching for justice and searching for him, and now he's participating in that same search for justice. But there's also an incredible discovery in and of itself, which we'll not get into because we kind of keep that as a bit of a reveal. But there's another discovery of life, and that in Oscar's world, and that becomes, I think, the manifestation of hope. And without hope, it would be very hard to tell the story. But without hope, it would be very hard, I think, for the activists and anthropologists to do this incredible work that they do there.
When I was watching, I was like, what a mind fuck to get a phone call and just realize your entire life is not what you thought it was. And you had an entire family that was murdered and you never got to know. That's so trippy. Do you still keep in contact with him? You must have seen him a bunch this year, maybe.
Yeah, I just saw Oscar last week in New York. We had a screening at the Museum of Jewish Heritage.
How's he, processing all this stuff?
I think Oscar is going to be, in one way or another, grappling with this truth for probably the rest of his life.
Because he had 7 siblings that got killed.
Yeah, he was 3 years old at the time, so he has no memory of any of this, and unlike the other boy who was slightly older, who remembers this boy Ramiro, but because he remembers it, he was also all too aware of who he was being raised by, was this soldier, and then on top of that, this practice wasn't that uncommon of kind of stealing a kid from the field of battle, but usually that kid was brought back and treated like an indentured servant or like a house slave.
Right.
That was Ramiro's life. His trauma didn't end after the most traumatic of experiences that you can imagine. Oscar was brought back by this lieutenant whose mother, the lieutenant's mother, apparently was always on him about, when are you going to get me a grandchild? And so he shows up one day and says, you always wanted a grandkid? Here you go. The mother's no longer in the equation. And even though some of this lieutenant's siblings had maybe their suspicions about, well, this is kind of weird, Oscar was treated like a member of the family. And that lieutenant died shortly thereafter. A year after.
Probably luckily.
Well, in some ways, probably luckily for Oscar.
Yeah. That's what I mean.
But even before he died, he wasn't treating him like the other soldier was treating Ramiro.
Okay.
And so he was brought into this family who only had the highest regard for this military hero of the family, the eldest son. And so even though Oscar doesn't have much memories of his abductor father figure, he still has an idea of this guy as his father. And so he grapples with this knowledge now of what this guy was actually involved with, and says, but at the end of the day, he still saved me. If he didn't take me, I wouldn't be here. So, that just in and of itself, I think, showcases how tricky it is. But it's been amazing to see Oscar really want to be a part of getting his story out there to help, because he didn't know any of this. Like many Guatemalans, he didn't know not just his own personal massacre that he ended up being involved with, but that so many others had taken place throughout the country he lived until he was 18. That's not unique. This was hid from many that lived in Guatemala, who maybe sensed that there was something not right, but that sense was then alleviated by, well, we're fighting the guerrilla. There are these skirmishes. There's this battle happening. But this is not a truth. This is not a chapter of history that's even taught in Guatemala. Like kids in Guatemalan schools don't learn about this. And a big part of that is because after the Truth Commission came out, which happened once there was a peace accord in 1996, after 36 years of fighting, the government never acknowledged the Truth Commission. So, our hopes is that this film does a couple things. One, it hopefully educates to an unassuming, unknowing North American audience like myself before I got involved, and I've tried to tell it from that perspective. That's going to be a valuable thing in and of itself. But in Guatemala, we're really hopeful that we will get the film out there in a significant way, just so hundreds of thousands of people were murdered by their own government. And so for those communities, for those families to see a version of their story played in public, and hopefully taught in schools, shown in schools, will be pretty meaningful. Yeah, we're in talks right now to make that happen.
Wow.
So
what's Guatemala like now? I almost ran there this year.
Really?
This past year.
I mean, Guatemala. Listen, most North Americans probably who've been to Guatemala don't even know that this happened, because it's an amazing tourist destination place. And when you come in to go to these beautiful volcanoes or resorts on the Caribbean or wherever, you can kind of navigate the cities and the landscapes without any knowledge that any of this happened. I mean, the Mayan ruins of Tikal are only less than a couple hours away from the village of Dos Aires, and so many come to go stay and see those ruins, having no idea that not that far away in the same region, these massacres were taking place not that far ago. So it wouldn't. I think you would have, one, been fine to run there.
Yeah. Okay.
And two, probably not the wiser, of any of this stuff. Yeah. But Guatemala had its own kind of uprising, interestingly enough, in the last little over a year ago because they ended up, corruption reigns within their government and has for some time. And just recently, they arrested both the president and vice president for charges of corruption. And the president was a former commander under this dictator during all this stuff in the 80s, which just shows that the people in power stayed in power,
So things are just starting to happen.
Yeah, I mean, well, these cases, this Dos Arias case is one of a handful of kind of landmark cases of actually finding justice. And so it's inspiring that more of it's happening, and that Rios Montt, this dictator, has just a couple weeks ago, a judge said there's enough evidence that he needs to stand trial for this particular massacre for charges of genocide and crimes against humanity. And it's...
In the States?
No. In Guatemala.
Okay.
Now, he's 90, and his lawyers have been trying to get this thrown out, saying he's mentally unfit.
Right.
There was another genocide trial where he was actually convicted, and he was the first head of state to ever be convicted by his own courts for charges of genocide. And then Guatemala, being all things Guatemala, within less than 2 weeks, they annulled the conviction, saying they're on a technicality. And it's been years now, and they've never had a retrial. So, that just kind of showcases it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Yeah. They had this big uprising. They had a special election after arresting the president. And it seemed like there was a groundswell of change in the air, and then they literally elected a comedian to be president, who many see as, a comedian, and nothing against comedians, but at the time, it's one of those things where us being in the United States, you see something like that and you go, God, what are these countries doing, right?
And then us. The biggest comedian.
Those in glass houses, don't throw stones. So I think it's a really interesting time, both in Guatemala and in our own country, for hopefully this story to get out there, because there's a lot of, even though it's a story that starts in the 80s, it continues to today, and I think it has a lot of relevancy, particularly, with the issues of immigration and foreign policy that have become all the more timely with our new administration. So
there were 15 soldiers right? Is that the number that were being looked for?
Well, there was about 20 involved in this.
Okay.
Some of them have died.
Yeah.
5 have been convicted in Guatemala for 6,060 years life sentences.
Oh, really?
Was 200 years for each victim, and so that's how they get to this number. I think it's I can't remember the math, but 3 have been found as U.S. citizens in the U.S., and so a third one just happening in January in Maryland.
Really?
And 2 were found in the U.S. and have been deported that weren't U.S. citizens. See, if you're a U.S. citizen, the government can't just outright deport you. They have to, because they don't have the jurisdiction to hold you accountable for what you did in another country. Right. But with these 3 U.S. citizens, none of them acknowledged on their application for citizenship. Right. That they were involved in the military, and you have to check all these boxes.
They killed anybody.
You weren't involved with any crimes or genocide and crimes against humanity, etc. And it's kind of like when you get on an airplane, it's like, do you have any explosive material in your bag? Right. No. And so they were able to kind of have, with 2 of these, and they'll do it with this 3rd soldier, have a de facto case where they prove their involvement in this massacre to then hold them accountable for naturalization fraud. And in those 2 cases, they've, including the one that I got to witness the sentencing on the first day of filming, both of those soldiers got the maximum penalty, which was 10 years in U.S. Federal prison, and then they will be stripped of their citizenship and deported back to Guatemala, where they will hopefully similarly be charged like the other soldiers. Oh, wow. Now, there are still 6 that they're looking for.
Yeah.
And
they could be anywhere. And maybe they're dead. Maybe they could be dead even.
Well, they could be, but they're probably in Guatemala or the U.S.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, so it's definitely a story that continues to reveal itself as not just a historic tale.
And you got a guy in the movie to talk about being a part of the genocide, and
we got 2 soldiers who participated to do on-camera interviews with us, telling us what they participated in.
It's frightening. One guy's like, I took a little girl, I was told to throw her in a well and not kill her, and throw her in the well alive.
Mm-hmm.
And of course she would die in the well, being buried with
they threw all the bodies in the well, but many of them they would smash their head in first with a sledgehammer,
or on a tree,
or with the little children. I mean, this is the harrowing stuff, of this story, and to have firsthand participants admit what they did, as well as Ibanez, who you're referring to, at one point in the interview, not provoked in any way, just stands up and starts to kind of act it out, and it was. It's surreal to have somebody, walk you through executing somebody.
How'd you get these guys?
So these guys were the linchpin to this whole case. If not for them coming forward many years ago to this human rights activist who was trying to find information about this massacre, working in the communities as a founder of a group that tries to find the disappeared and to find these mass graves. Who she herself lost her brother. Her brother was disappeared by the government. One of the soldiers came to her and said, "I was involved," and shared his story. And she can
out of guilt.
I think he speaks to saying it never sat well with him. He was a cook, so he was the kind of an outsider within this very elite special forces troop. It's kind of like the Navy SEALs of Guatemala, and he was forced to participate in the massacre, but he wasn't really one of these guys, and it seems it didn't sit well with him. And he would speak to the idea of seeing his children playing in the yard many years later and not being able to not think of what happened to the children of Dos Aires. So
you had some sort of conscience.
Some sort of level of remorse, possibly. But he also talked another soldier into coming forward, who was one of these fully fledged soldiers who, was just following orders, is what he would say, between the testimony of these 2 guys, that's how they found out about these boys that had been abducted. So if they hadn't come forward and shared what they knew, we wouldn't know that there were these boys who were abducted. And so this didn't happen in Guatemala. You didn't have soldiers who would kind of break this code of silence. And so they needed to really corroborate their stories. It wasn't enough to just have their firsthand witness accounts. They needed this DNA evidence, or this living proof evidence that they could get if they could find these 2 boys being raised by these soldiers.
Then there's a guy in it who was living in America, and they found out where he lived, and they knocked on his door, and he knew.
Right. Well, he was one of those soldiers who was
one of the soldiers.
So, and that's where we have the U.S. ends up having, if any character or institution has a redemptive arc in this film, it's really the U.S. Because here we were on the wrong side of history in the early 80s, with the Reagan administration, supporting this dictatorship that is now being
sent money,
sending supplies, training these guys, these actual special forces people. But now there is a group, and there's been a group for some time in the United States within Immigration's Customs Enforcement that is specifically charged with looking for people involved with crimes against humanity, things of these nature, who are in our borders as citizens or not as citizens, but here and shouldn't be. We don't want to be home to people who commit these kind of acts, and that starts with not wanting to have Nazis seek refuge here,
right.
And many other iterations since. And so it's really the case in Guatemala, hit a wall after a period of time, and nothing happened for a decade. There was no political will to really go, even though they found one of the boys, Ramiro, and they felt like they had a pretty strong case to issue a bunch of arrest warrants. Nothing happened for a decade. But in the process, the U.S. became aware of the names of the other soldiers that they were looking for, and so it got on the radar of this special human rights violator section within ICE, and it turned up that one of these guys was living as a U.S. resident, U.S. citizen, in South Florida, just outside of Miami, and with a family, with a son who had joined the U.S. military and fought in Iraq, a hard worker for country club down there, and yeah, so there's this special agent Longo who's featured in the film, who ultimately needed to try and not coerce, but get this guy to see if he could get him to confess, because they didn't have any other way to really probably arrest him, unless they got him to say what he did. And amazingly, he admitted to all of it. And he says that he basically had been waiting that someday they'd find him.
I found that really interesting, because the way the Longo, is that what he's saying? The way he describes it is, he knocks on the door, he knows the jig is up, he allows them in, they sit at the kitchen table, and the guy just talks, "Hey, buddy." He starts just confessing and like being, I think, emotional about it too, right? Like,
yeah, very emotional. Well, the special agent comes from a background in a lot of like therapy, but also not therapy in the sense like he's talked to people who've been involved with very heinous things, and so I think he knew how to approach him in a way to make him feel comfortable in sharing what is was not in his best interest, obviously, to share, but he clearly had a weight on his chest and wanted to get it off,
which I found really interesting, because this guy that did all these terrible things and probably justified it when he was younger, maybe through living here in America, having a family, now is kind of haunted by it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like actions speak louder than words, and he admitted to something he certainly didn't need to admit to. Yeah. I always want to be careful not to speak or try to put myself in the mind space of somebody,
sure.
Especially somebody who's done. I mean, if they've done, I don't want to over rationalize or give somebody a feeling of guilt or remorse. Unless they explicitly, admit to it as much. But I think at a certain point, I think for me, actually meeting some of these guys and who had committed these heinous acts, you realize they're not just like evil incarnate, And even though they've done very evil things,
yeah, that's hard to believe. Right?
You go, well, they're human beings, and I think for me, it reminds me that we all have the potential to do great good and great evil under probably the right circumstances, and that doesn't in any way want to rationalize away their culpability for what they did, but it gives me a better empathy to understand how these things happen and how they continue to happen throughout the world and throughout history. It's not just because there are naturally born bad people, Yeah.
Deborah came in with Banner. So you heard a dog drinking water and Deborah's making tea.
Yeah, now you explain what it is.
But Deborah was asking me some questions about the documentary. Did you remember your question? About like how for the soldiers.
Oh, yeah, I guess I was curious. Like that's an interesting line, right? That if you're under orders, at one point if you're under orders to commit heinous acts in some ways, at what point is it then your culpability versus you're a victim of a regime, So I didn't know, I haven't seen the film yet, but I was curious if...
Yeah, no, I mean, I think especially when those orders aren't just empty orders.
Right.
Like the likelihood if you don't follow orders, you're probably, you know, your own life is probably at risk, as well as your livelihood of this is how you make a living. A lot of these guys is not much different than a lot of the people who serve in our own military do so because it's the best job opportunity available to them. You know, there's huge swaths of incredible poverty in Guatemala, and so a job means a lot to provide for you, for your family. And so at the very least, if you don't follow orders, you're putting that in question. But beyond that, especially in during this time, if you didn't do what they told you to do, they'd probably kill you.
Yeah.
Now, all that said, you know, while I'm making a film about a guy who's at 3 years old is abducted, I myself had a 3-year-old. And then my wife and I made another baby in the process of the 2.5 years that this took. And so I had an all too real reminder of what these guys were doing to young children, as well as a clear and present reminder that even though Oscar didn't remember any of this, it doesn't because he was too young. He wasn't too young to experience it. My 3-year-old, now 5, even my 19-month-old, to undergo a trauma like this, you know, is just devastating to actually put my daughters in those shoes. So when I think of what they did to young children, not just in this village, but in countless villages, I'd really like to think I would never do that, that there is no circumstance. Now, it's easier said than done. And that's why I have a hard time wanting to let them off the hook of their culpability for what they did.
Yeah, well, I'm not
part of me, I'd say, okay, well, kill me because I'm not going to kill a baby. You know,
Right.
I'm not going to do that. But you know,
if you're raised in that environment,
yeah, and especially,
the violence
and it gets back to this idea of the other. If you've dehumanized those children, you make them seem like, well, if we don't eradicate them, they're just going to grow up to be supporters of the guerrilla communists. Like, these are communists. They're not humans, they're communists. So they're like an infestation. Right. And when you're able to do that, then I think you can, you know, check your humanity at the door.
It's that Black Mirror episode.
It's that Black Mirror episode, and it's like every other genocide that takes place where we go, yeah, I'm sure there were really good Nazis. I'm sure there were good people, family people that were Germans at the time that ended up becoming the quintessential evil Nazi. And yet you can't just say, okay, everybody was a whole generation of Germans were just wired bad, you know? But they were force-fed an ideology that said the Jews just weren't people. Because if they were people, how could you do that to other people, you know? Unless you saw them as some existential threat against your own livelihood. And if we don't kill you, you're going to kill us, you know?
Yeah. Did I answer?
More than I could ever.
Yeah. I mean, there was even a scene in the movie where they're, what is the word? Excavating or
Exhumed.
Yeah,
exhumation.
Exhuming, I guess this pit or well or something of just dozens, maybe a couple hundred of bodies, like skeletons.
Well, that's where they put all of the bodies in.
And you're there.
No, so that all happened before me.
Oh, that happened before.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was other footage. Okay.
Yeah.
But because you mentioned in the Q&A,
I did attend an exhumation. They're still exhuming these mass graves throughout the countryside. It's just the one particular one at Dos Aires happened long before I got involved. But I did have the opportunity to film, you know, these anthropologists exhuming a mass grave. It was just 3 bodies, but just 3 bodies. It's still 3 families that are destroyed.
Day, right?
Right.
That's a good 3 bodies.
And so I got to bear witness to kind of an inverse of a funeral. You know, you have the community, the families there watching as their loved ones are coming out of the ground via these anthropologists, and I had never seen anything like that. That was day 2 for me in Guatemala,
And you said you had security while you were there, in the
throughout. I mean, there was no threat with this community at all.
But just in case, right?
But yeah, I never wanted to be that naive, Western white guy with a camera thinking I can just show up and point that camera at people and wade into this story without being as smart about it as possible. And there are those within the government who would definitely not want this story to be told. Now, was I ever at a real point of being threatened by that? Not necessarily, but there's a lot of other violence within Guatemala. There's a massive drug trade, and so, I never wanted to be the guy who ends up in a news story because something happens to me or to my cinematographer or crew, because we just didn't, weren't smart about it.
How many of you were there traveling?
Mainly, it was just Mike Perry, my cinematographer, myself, and Scott Greathead, this human rights attorney representing Oscar, is also a co-producer on the project because he came and joined us for many of our shoots. And then it was we were tapping into the amazing resources of the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala, who were our on-the-ground folks, not only supporting us with the security, but transportation, and really vouching for us in these communities. So when I show up on day 2 in Guatemala to this community that's bearing witness to this incredibly emotional event of seeing, a handful of loved ones come out of the ground, I wanted to film it because I felt like I don't know if I'm ever going to see something like this again. I mean, the sad news is
Hopefully
you could see it quite a few times if you just hung out with this organization. But having never seen anything like it, I delicately asked, can I film this? And they said, of course, we want you to film this. They want, the truth to be known. And so yeah, that kind of just set the tone for filming there, of just being like, okay, we've got a responsibility now to do right by these people.
Did you feel like, because you did how many years of working on it? Like 2.5 years?
It was 2.5 years. So that first day of filming was February 2014, and we premiered it and finished it in late August, right before the festival.
When do you feel like, all right, we gotta stop filming, or we're done. We're done with this story, because it feels like it's still going. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that was the beauty of knowing on day 1 that I knew how it ended.
Right.
That's not to say I knew how to tell it, but I just felt like I had an ending inherent. Right. But it's kind of like, not to pivot to our collaboration, but like your story had we kind of knew when it was going to end, right? We knew that this exercise of what you're doing, of running 12 marathons, the 12th marathon was probably going to be close to the end of the story. And so this wasn't a film where it was like some verite following life as it evolves sort of tale and waiting for it to end in some organic way. It's not to say that there aren't things that continue to happen and the ripple effect of the story doesn't continue. So our cards at the end of the film become outdated because we can't keep up with the story. But yeah, I knew the essence of the general story I wanted to tell. And the largest challenge was the fact that even though this story's, this happened in Guatemala, to go and talk to the first-hand participants meant I had to go and film in Miami. I had to go to D.C., Boston several times, New York, Winnipeg, Canada, in LA. And so it just shows you this one massacre, of which there were hundreds, of this one country decades ago, and the tentacles now that
All over.
we have victims and perpetrators all over the hemisphere, you know, and they're in our midst. I mean, we're here in Los Angeles. There's 750,000 Guatemalans in Los Angeles. It's the second highest population of Guatemalans in any city in the world outside of Guatemala City. And dude, so many of them, you start talking to them, which I am now very prone to doing.
Yeah.
So many of them came from during this period of time, or their parents came, you know, and they're everywhere we are. You can't throw a stone in a restaurant kitchen or a landscaping service or a nanny service, housekeepers, like they're, agricultural industry, like they are the
my Uber driver the other day, he said he was from Guatemala, and I was like, I just saw a documentary that took place.
That same thing happened to me. I was going to the airport a couple months ago, and Rosa was, and I was like, I have a feeling Rosa's from Central America, but she was from El Salvador, and she said she came here in '84 when her husband was murdered, and it was the same story, but a different country, and it's like, oh my God, So I hope, just like you taking an Uber and going, hey, Guatemala means something to me now.
Yeah.
I hope that we can start a conversation with this film.
It makes me so sad how they, like dictators, and just this mindset of like they just dig in their heels and their nails, and they just want to hold on to like just this way of living of murder and just destruction and power and money. You know what I mean? Like Putin and all these guys, and it just makes me so sad that so many people have to suffer. It just makes me so sad.
It was, to like live in this story for a couple plus years, rereading transcripts of these interviews with victims and survivors, trying to figure out the best way to tell the story, and be all too aware that like this wasn't an anomaly in Guatemala, and then Guatemala is not an anomaly in Central America or Latin America, and that's not an anomaly within the world at large. And here we have Syria and everything that's happening in Syria, and I have friends who, made a film there, won the Academy Award this year, and to hear, the devastation of very similar experience of them wading into this footage and these interviews to try to tell that story. It's like, it felt like the exact same thing we're talking about here, and that's why, it's hard to be a romantic optimist when you know this kind of truth about our species, that we have this capability of just being so awful to each other, and yet, any parent will tell you also just see the beauty of life and the potential to do just such amazing things, and now we find ourselves in a period of real anxiety or unpredictability.
I call it Trump's-iety.
Trump's-iety is probably, you could get that copyrighted, make some money. So I don't know, man. I mean, I think it's all the more, though, to not stick our head in the sand and act like this stuff doesn't happen. Because if we don't try to understand why it happens and why we're even kind of culpable in it, then it'll keep happening.
Well, you mentioned running blind. I ran 12 marathons in 12 states in 2012 because I'm going blind.
You did?
Yep.
When did you do this? In 2012?
So, and I knew I was like, well, this is a big deal for me, and I know I'll never do it again. So I would like to have some sort of something to remember it by. So I knew I wanted to film it and try to get something made. And so I contacted, I got involved with this couple, Patrick Creedon and Christine O'Malley, and Patrick was a maybe on directing it, and he was gonna film some of it, and I was gonna try to film whatever I could film, and we were putting out like little shorts of what we were filming to raise money and stuff like that. And you saw some of this, and you got curious about what I was doing.
Yeah, I remember you kind of telling the world, the improv world especially, that you were going to be doing this thing. And I thought, that's amazing. What is that? 12 marathons. And I'd always had a fascination with people who run marathons. I'm like, yeah, I'd like to maybe do that one day. Though I have a pretty horrible left knee that anytime I just even flirt with the idea of running,
it starts throbbing.
It starts throbbing just thinking about it.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's in my cards, though. Ironically, I've now been a part of 3 marathoner documentaries, one of which is premiering today in Boston.
Congratulations.
But yeah, I remember seeing you sent an email blast as you were fundraising, and I think you sent one or a couple. It was like the first time you'd sent anything after you had announced it. Like you announced it in January or something, and then maybe it was the summer that you're like, oh, I'm still doing this, and here's a couple of the stories, you know? And I remember watching them and first just being like, good for EJ, man. That's amazing. I feel like so many people do stuff or say they're going to do stuff, particularly in this town, but I think in life in general, and then just don't back it up.
Yeah.
They just find reasons to get out of it.
Yeah.
And I don't know what I was expecting. I don't think I was expecting much from these videos. I thought they would just be kind of like, you know, you filming yourself.
Right.
Then I was like, oh, somebody knows what they're doing here. Like there's some really good cinematography, you know, like somebody's like tracking with you while you're running. Like that's not easy to do. But I was kind of underwhelmed by how they'd been cut together. Like I thought these could be better. And I was working as a documentary editor at the time. I just finished editing 2 feature documentaries, not, you know, within a span of a few months when you sent that. And so I think I just said, let's go out to lunch or something. I'd love to hear more about what you're doing. Because I thought, if nothing else, maybe I can help you edit these things better. To make them more effective, you know?
Please.
And then and I was like, so what's your plan, though? What are you going to do with all of this stuff? It seems like you're going to have a whole wealth of this, you know? And that was when you said, you know, you'd hoped to make a larger documentary, but that kind of hadn't happened or wasn't happening for various reasons. Yeah. So I was like, well, let's go finish, keep doing it. And let's do that. Let's make that documentary, you know?
But that was, when you said stuff like that, I was like, oh my God, is he going to do this? I was like, I can't pay you. I can't afford to pay you or anything. But you were so kind to be like, well, let me see the footage and maybe I could do something with it. And I did. And then you, not only did you do something with it, you filmed extra stuff, interviews and the like, and just different types of shots, and Mike helped out.
Well, it was really, you know, Mike Perry, who was my cinematographer on Finding Oscar, and is just a really good friend. You know, he just made himself available because he knew it was a good project to be available. And as long as you can kind of keep the ask to, like, maybe it's a couple days of shooting, you know, and it's funny being here in your kitchen and remembering interviewing Deb in the other room and you guys walking down the street and all that stuff. But it's like you had all of this kind of disparate stuff, and so we needed to kind of create the connective tissue and the cohesive stories of primarily from you and Deb to help us weave all of that stuff together into what was Running Blind. Yeah,
and I was so thrilled and thankful. Still am. Thank you very much.
Well, it was my first. I'm grateful for the fact that you allowed me to do it because it was my first. I'd been editing documentaries, which I hadn't really intended to do either, but I felt I was doing a decent amount of directing, of which is what I always wanted to do, was direct, and I was bringing that to the edit room. And so now I was learning how to put it together in addition to how to want to direct it. And so you kind of popped up with, hey, I got all this stuff. I don't know what to do with it. And it's like, all right, well, maybe here's an opportunity for me to also, work on, I wish I had been able to start with you at the beginning.
Yeah, me too.
But, I'm grateful for the fact that there was still an opportunity to make sense of what you had been able to get with Patrick and on your own. And it's amazing how many people see it and don't have any other idea that we weren't doing this the whole time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it feels cohesive.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like, oh, that's the part where somebody else was doing it. And then
Yeah.
there was these 5 races in the middle where nobody was doing it. Or,
Well, I had to really scramble. I was doing Craigslist ads in different cities that I was running in. And just
you were producing your own thing in addition to running 12 marathons.
which I actually did.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize how difficult, I mean, I knew how difficult it was, but not so much as this past year I wanted to run 7 marathons and I couldn't do it because I got sick so many times and my body just was starting to fall apart. My knees, I have knee problems
Welcome
now.
to This is 40, right?
Yeah. It's true. I went to a doctor and I was like, my knees bothering me, and I never had knee problems before. And he goes, how old are you? I was like, just turned 40. He goes, well, that's there you go.
Yeah.
I go, seriously? That's serious?
4 decades of walking around on those things. Every
But
once in a while
literally,
running
like,
a
that's
marathon.
the cutoff. It's
Yeah.
like you turn 40.
It's just yet another thing to actually be depressed about and getting older. It's not just a theory, man. There are consequences to
But it was so great because you were able to get people to work for free and do things for free or for very little. You even got Journey song for a while.
For like nothing for the festival, right?
For like $1,000 or something.
Yeah,
that you
for
guys
very
covered
cheap.
or
Yeah,
something.
yeah. It was very. I mean, it was.
It was really cheap.
It was for a Journey track. It was
Don't
very
Stop
very
Believing.
cheap. Yeah.
But which, by the way, every time I hear it, I go,
They
play
it at every single marathon race too.
Yeah.
I've come to realize it's like, of course they do. It's kind of like Queen and We Will Rock You. It's
Right.
like it's like every stadium ever,
And whenever I hear it, I go, that's my song.
Yeah.
I now equate it to like, that's my song.
Well, you know who else was great? It was Cotton Jones gave us.
Oh yeah, Cotton Jones.
I just saw Michael now. So they've had kids. He
wow.
and his wife, because they were
How many?
I think they're on their second.
Wow.
And so now he's touring as just himself, or putting out music as himself, because music is not that much different than improv, is not that much different than filmmaking. Of like, there's a period of time where you can be nothing but this thing, and then you start to make babies, have relationships, buy houses, do all these other things that responsibilities kick in. But it was great to see him. He's putting out some great music, and they were so generous to give us 3 songs for nothing.
Very generous.
And Paul did the score for nothing. I mean, we got some, but I think, again, it comes back to you. It was an easy sell for me to say, hey, this guy is doing this thing. Doesn't it sound cool? And let's help him out,
Yeah.
So I think your inspiration helped make those asks a little easier,
Thank you. And it was a good year for that stuff because I made all my goals, and as opposed to last year, I didn't make any of my goals really.
Yeah.
I mean, I got to every continent, but I ran 2 fulls and 5 halves, and I didn't raise nearly what I wanted to raise, and so it was a rougher year last year.
Yeah, well, I can imagine just the travel to different
the
continents.
travel
If you're
was
getting
brutal.
sick and getting that, like just the limited domestic travel I've been doing, though it's not been that limited, but it's all domestic. Like, it takes a toll, man. Like, and so to then go do and I'm not doing anything other than eating and drinking badly, as opposed to
Right.
running 26.2 miles in Antarctica or something.
It was gonna be 26.2. It turned out
13.1. Yeah. But you gave us. I mean, we knew how it was gonna end, but we didn't know we were gonna be able to end on a high note, right?
Yeah.
So
I went to South America 3 times last year.
wow, that's cool.
Once
I've never even been to South America. I'd never been to Central America before making this Finding Oscar, but I've gone back quite a few times.
I went to Chile, and then I went to Rio.
Because you need to go to Chile to get to
Antarctica.
Antarctica, right?
That's where I stayed. And I went to Rio, and I was going to run before the Olympics and all that stuff. I was going to run, and about 2 days before the run, I got what they call it, norovirus.
What's that?
Where you
Oh, I
just
got that recently.
Shit and
yeah.
puke for 48 hours straight.
So I got that in Guatemala, or a version of it. I don't know if it's norovirus or if it's just food poisoning. I think it was food poisoning. Though I think I got norovirus like 3 weeks ago.
Oh, really?
My whole family had it, besides Pearl, thank God. But yeah, it was bad. It was real bad. I mean, it was like you're in a third world country, and you're shitting and puking at the same time.
Yep.
And you're like, this is like the quintessential being sick in a third world country. And yet I was like, all right, and now we're going to the next shoot spot. And
wow, did you do that? Because I could not get out of bed.
I had to go film, and I was like filming,
How'd you do that?
Survivors
I was literally having diarrhea at least every hour.
I'm pretty sure everybody's diarrhea at some point. If you haven't, yeah, God bless you, man.
At least every hour. Sometimes a couple times an hour. To the point of I couldn't sleep. I was up every hour running to the toilet, and I'm going, what am I shitting out at
There's
this
nothing
point?
even left.
There's nothing left.
It's like, don't drink anything, then you just get all dehydrated.
Once I started eating again, once I started feeling better and eating, I didn't shit again for like a week.
Yeah.
Because it was like slowly working down, because I had nothing in my system at all. And my stomach was getting distended from like gas and stuff. Like I didn't have anything in my belly, but it was so painful.
It's a great podcast. We've covered everything from geopolitics to
diarrhea,
distended bellies filled with gas.
Well, my guide, who's run with me a bunch of times, David Wright, he's like, "How's Rio?" I was like, I'm sick. I got norovirus. He goes, "Well, just walk it." I was like, No, you don't understand. I'm a human juicer right now, and I can't make it from one even toilet to the next toilet without probably shitting myself.
Yeah.
Or standing straight, because my stomach was hurting me so badly.
Yeah, man. I mean, I was filming, and then I was like, I remember we were at this like memorial site that was a former military base and clandestine cemetery with mass graves everywhere. And I went and filmed for a little bit, and then I just went and like laid back in the back of a pickup truck, and I was just like, I'm gonna die. Oh, God. It was a rough one, but
so I had to go back. So that's why I was thinking Guatemala, because I was looking up more runs. And
I mean, if you do go back, I can hook you up with some great people. Seriously,
I probably won't be running there anyway.
Yeah.
But so I was looking for. I didn't want to fly too far, because I was doing 12-hour flights to so many places.
Of course.
I just wanted a shorter flight and something flat.
You're like, is Puerto Rico, is that South
Does
America?
that count?
Does that count? Like,
I don't think it
how
counts.
about Rosarito, Mexico? Does that count? Can I just go over the border?
So I ended up doing Ecuador.
Oh, okay. That's cool.
Which was, no elevation.
I remember
flat.
when you were telling me about this project, and I was like, I probably don't have the bandwidth to do it, but man, I'd love to go to 7 continents with you. That would be fun. I haven't gone to any of those places. I did another documentary about these 2 women who traveled to 16 countries in 1 year.
Yeah,
and I edited it
out and
around. This amazing lesbian couple who went searching for the LGBT communities in all of these different countries, 4 different continents, 16 countries in a year.
Did you do all that too?
I didn't do a lick of it. I co-directed the film by finding the story in their footage. So it was kind of like your project.
Right.
But all user generated. Like it was all their filming.
I see.
But they're not filmmakers. So
it was just
here was a drive with 100 hours of footage. Help us find a narrative, narrative structure and a feature documentary in it. So I vicariously went to 16 countries that I'd never gone to.
Well, if you ever want to work for free again, I filmed a ton of stuff last year.
Well, I think you also got me at the right spot where I didn't have three mouths to feed.
I think I did really. I think I really did get you at a good time. Because I don't think I could have gotten you after that.
My rate has slightly gone up from zero, hopefully, out of the
well
maze.
deserved.
Yeah,
I'll say
it's a good bar. It's a good bar to cross. You know, it's like if the threshold is zero, you know, success is not that difficult.
What? How long did it take you to edit Running Blind?
I feel like it wasn't that long, actually. I feel like once we did the interviews and stuff, I feel like it was a few weeks and I had a rough cut. Don't you? I mean,
I remember.
I remember just like jumping because it was semi-episodic and it was only, what was it, 30 minutes long?
Yeah.
As opposed to like Finding Oscars 95 minutes long. So I feel like, you know, we also had to get it done fast because Mountain Film was interested in it, and I really wanted to premiere it there. And we had gotten an extension, I think, on the deadline to submit, but I feel like it was within 4 or 5 weeks we had a cut to submit to them, which is pretty fast.
Yeah.
You know, but
you had to watch all that footage.
Yeah, I had to watch a lot of it. I mean, you get good as an editor. You get pretty good at skimming.
Yeah.
And but there are certain times where you have to listen and watch at the same time. Like, there's just no way around it, you know? Yeah. There was a moment, it's funny, there's a moment in Out and Around where you would probably just skim through it and never think it was worthwhile footage. But what it was is they were having trouble with the camera and they were like trying to wipe it, but they was still recording. Mm-hmm. And so this is a great moment that kind of reveals that they, you know, it reminds the audience, the people who are making this film aren't professional filmmakers, and it's them. And it's very personal, and it's great because it's like, what's going on? How do we get this fog off of it? And you can hear them talking about it. Then one of them goes, Lisa just farted again, you know? And it's this great, it's this great human moment that if you were just like, you would never even hear this like great off-camera line, you know? So those are the diamonds in the rough that you can't not know unless you watch all of this stuff. So at some point you have to watch it in some capacity.
So you work for Kennedy Marshall. Is it still Kennedy Marshall?
Yeah, it's the Kennedy Marshall Company.
Kennedy Marshall.
Yeah, but even though Kathleen Kennedy runs Lucasfilm now,
that's what I was
the name of the company is the same. It's essentially Frank Marshall's company.
Well, it's cool seeing like Finding Oscar, and it says producer or executive producer Steven Spielberg on it. I was like, oh, that's cool.
That was cool.
But you've worked on some Spielberg projects in the past.
Yeah. So I started with set production work, like I was saying, in Chicago, and then worked on a big movie, and then those assistant directors brought me out here and ended up kind of winning the set PA lottery when I got a job working as Steven Spielberg's on-set assistant. And part of my job, my duties on set with him, was to carry a video camera with me all the time. So here I found myself not only just working for Steven Spielberg, which in and of itself was like a pinch me kind of thing, but I'm filming one of the greatest filmmakers making films, you know? And that was kind of the beginning of my documentarian career.
Because did you know you wanted to be a documentarian?
No, I wanted to be I thought I was going to be writing comedies and making, I was going to go back and be the next John Hughes of Chicago, like I'll do LA for a couple of years, then I'll come back and start writing and directing my own Chicago comedies,
Planes, Trains Part 2.
Exactly. That's just waiting to be remade.
Rebooted.
Oh, for sure. That would be a travesty, though. But I never saw any of this coming. But after working with Spielberg for a few films, I left to write a screenplay, a comedy that I'd pitched him to DreamWorks commissioned me to write a screenplay.
Oh, wow. And
while I was writing it, they greenlit Indiana Jones 4 and asked me to come back just to do the documentary, just to do the on-set, behind-the-scenes stuff. And that's when I started working with Frank Marshall, because he's produced all the Indiana Jones movies. And I'd met Frank through working with his wife, Kathy, on War of the Worlds in Munich, but he really got introduced to me as this on-set documentarian. And even though I didn't think of myself as as a documentarian, I just thought of myself as a aspiring writer-director type who has this weird gig of being able to like film Steven Spielberg making movies every so often, you know.
Yeah.
When Frank got commissioned to do one of the original 30 for 30 documentaries for ESPN, he had never directed a documentary, and he reached out to me to collaborate with him to help him shoot it and to edit it. And I said, yeah, let's do that.
Wow.
Are
you pinching yourself? Because like these guys are legends.
Well, you know, at that point in time when he called, I was really grateful that he called because I hadn't cashed a paycheck in a year and a half. I turned in that script the day before the Writers Guild strike. You know, it's 2007. It's 2017 now, 10 years later, and they're talking about possibly striking again. But like, I went on the picket lines for 3 months. Then the Great Recession happened of 2008. So I picked like the worst time in the world to go be freelance director for hire, you know? And so when Frank called, I said, yeah, I'll take that job. I need that job. You know, even though I had never edited I had never edited anything over a few minutes long, really. I didn't think of myself as a documentarian nor an editor, but I needed a gig, and it wasn't lost on me who I'd be collaborating with, you know? So, I mean, but yeah, dude, to see Steven Spielberg, Frank Marshall, and then my name show up in the credits for this film that I'm really proud of it's not lost on me. But it didn't all just kind of come with some dumb luck, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm incredibly grateful of the good fortune, but I'm also very aware of busting my ass to get here and working on projects for free, you know, and kind of paying it forward wherever I could, or paying the dues to be able to find myself doing this and collaborating with the folks I am now.
What was Spielberg like to work with and be around for all that time?
It was great. I mean, if I didn't go to film school, so working on sets was kind of like my film school, and working with Steven was like grad school. You know, like I had a backstage pass to just be able to witness an incredible artist doing his thing. And he was very accessible to me. And, you know, that said, I was incredibly reverent to the situation. I mean, you can ask Kim. I never talked more in my sleep and I've never had more anxiety dreams than I did when I worked for Steven, because I thought, don't fuck this up. You're going to, you know, I had like a running list of things in my head of like what I could get fired for, not because that there was that ever-present threat, but I was so aware of like, don't blow this opportunity, dude, you know? So no, he was really great, and he was very gracious and supportive, and so much so that, you know, his company bought an idea and paid me to write a screenplay, you know? So
whatever happened to that?
It, you know, during that Writers Guild strike, it floundered basically, because then Paramount, because it was a DreamWorks Paramount project. I'm pretty sure my script was the first contractual agreement between Paramount and DreamWorks after Paramount absorbed DreamWorks. And the schisms already started to happen. They had a pretty public divorce not long after, it seemed like. So it was funny because it was a female-driven comedy that I'd written, and I think it also possibly maybe just missed its moment. It was a little too early for Hollywood to actually acknowledge that, you know, a woman in the leading role could actually do something at the box office, you know?
Might be good now.
Yeah, so if anybody's listening, Paramount owns it. It's called Pink Slip.
Let's resurrect that
Let's
thing.
do it, please. I'll do another pass on it. I need to get my Writers Guild dues if I want to get back on the health insurance there.
And you worked on Terminal. True.
I worked on
right?
Terminal, War of the Worlds, Munich, and
Indiana Jones.
with Spielberg.
I had Scott Adsit here.
Oh, yeah?
Did you see him at all? On
Yeah,
the set?
he only worked like 2
days.
days.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I remember Scott, but I knew of Scott.
Yeah.
Just because of the improv world, and I remember talking to him about it. And of course, it was one of those great things of like, I thought, you're legendary in the improv world, but he's fish out of water on a Steven Spielberg set.
Right.
You know,
It was so funny talking. He was on my podcast and talking to him about it, and he's like, it was so cool because Steven Spielberg was like a little kid. He was so excited, and he comes up to me and he's telling me about this new snow machine, and he's so excited. It looks like real snow, and it even melts or something like that. And
well, that's the thing. Oh yeah, because he was driving the cab.
yeah.
Yeah, that is part of what makes Steven so great, is because he's held on in one way or another, certainly through most of his career, that inner child, and being able to tell stories that that scratch the itch of what a child audience would really resonate with. I mean, we grew up in the 80s, man. We had the Amblin Entertainment, started by Steven and Kathy and Frank, making all these movies that were for us, and yet they adults loved them too. They weren't just for kids, and that's that straddling those two is so easier said than done. Now that I have kids, I see how so much content can just be played to a kid level that isn't accessible to adults. Though, Pixar does a really great job, I think, of telling adult stories that kids enjoy,
Yeah, because it's so easy, because like I'll watch some kid stuff sometimes just flipping around, and it's just about crazy noises and crazy gestures and just high colors and just craziness.
Right.
Just
and I go, stimulation.
Wow. Stimulation.
Right.
And I go, I watch about 2 seconds of this and I'm out.
You're like, I'm not on enough drugs to enjoy this.
Did you have any interactions with Tom Cruise or Tom Hanks or Eric Bana or Harrison Ford?
Yeah, all of them.
Shia LaBeouf?
All. Absolutely. I mean, I was Steven Spielberg's shadow. So, unless they just ignored me. No, I got along with, varying degrees, all those guys.
What's their set personas?
They're all different, you know. But the great thing about working on, I bet they're all different, but I bet they're even more different on different sets.
Yeah.
Meaning, if you're on a Steven Spielberg set, you kind of check your ego at the door.
Yeah.
You're not the biggest, cook in this kitchen.
Yeah, right.
And so you get to see guys, I worked with Daniel Craig. I'm like, and I really enjoyed working with Daniel Craig, but I'm like, I bet Daniel might be different on a James Bond set than he is on a Munich set, right? Yeah. And Tom Cruise probably similar when he's Mission Impossible as opposed to War of the Worlds. They bring a reverence, and that's not in any way am I trying to say something negative about them, but they're those franchises, those movies, they are at the epicenter and the biggest dick in the room, and it's just that's not the case when you're on a Steven Spielberg set. So you get to see a certain humility from these huge, larger than life actors, which is really great.
Even Shia LaBeouf.
Well, Shia wasn't even that big.
Yeah, I know.
I remember going and seeing Transformers while we were making Indiana Jones 4. So his meteoric rise was just happening, and I think a lot of his very public, struggles of how to deal with that level of public fame as well as scrutiny was just starting, because it was the next movie that he did where he got arrested in a Walgreens, and and he was in Chicago for filming, I think, on another Transformers, and he wouldn't leave the Walgreens or something, where you're just like, and then that was car accident, DUI, this, that, the other, and I like Shia. But
was he professional on set? Did he show up on time, know his lines?
Yeah, no, I mean, I can't think of any. Again, maybe he isn't that way now. I don't know. He's doing some pretty interesting out there shit.
I see Harrison Ford say, "Get your shit together."
But he was, he knew who he was working for.
No kidding.
I mean, he was not the Transformers was not the big. I mean, it just came out and it was doing well, but it wasn't his third Transformers movie and billions of dollars international grosses or anything. Yeah. So no, I mean, it was a great experience. To work with all those guys. Tom Hanks is amazing. Eric Bana, I got along really well with Eric Bana.
He's great.
Enjoyed him.
He seems super cool.
Yeah, he comes from a comedy background.
Yeah,
That's the irony.
He did stand-up.
Stand-up, and he was on the equivalent of like SNL in Australia. And I'll never forget, Kim had come to visit in Budapest for like a week, and it'd be Kim, Eric, and I talking at Video Village, and he'd be cracking us up, making us laugh about something. And they'd be like, "Okay, Eric, ready for your on set?" And he'd just go whoomp and just like go from smile to morose, like you know.
You ever see Chopper?
I have.
Ooh.
Yeah, and that, you know, but that's how he all of a sudden went from, hey, everybody knows you in Australia as the comedian, and you're completely cast against type. And now he's done so many more iterations of the Chopper-inspired kind of role than the comedy, though it seems like there's a few people in town who understand him to be funny, like Apatow, you know, and who've tried to tap into his comedy ability. But I, you know, I really appreciate that. Not that I've worked with a lot of method actors per se, but it's refreshing when somebody goes, okay, I don't need everybody to like treat me differently for me to do my craft. I understand if somebody needs to be in a headspace or something, but it's also refreshing to go, we're all just playing make-believe here, not just the actors. All of this is like, let's just, you know, I think it's too easy to kind of get up our own asses with how important making movies are compared to other things in the world, you know? So yeah.
I imagine Spielberg is like a really even-tempered person on set. Like
he's great. Listen, again, sets the bar. It's like, there's no room in this industry, in my opinion, for the likes of the screamers and, you know, the notorious like bad boys, whether it's a Michael Bay or Brett Ratner or Antoine Fuqua. You know, you just hear these stories just sound like major assholes to deal with. Yeah. It's like, how is that allowed? Yeah. You know, when
they let the pressure get to them, I guess. So where Spielberg is like,
I don't know. I think that's letting them off the hook. That's making it too. I think they get rewarded for being assholes. Yeah. But yeah. So I mean, I just, you know, and it was after that experience. That's why I was like, well, I'm not doing this for anybody else again. Like I have to go do. It's like put up or shut up now. You know.
And he works fast, right?
He works really fast. If he ever gets annoyed, it's just we're not moving fast enough. You know, he wants to keep going. He shoots, you know, big movies, long scripts much faster than anybody. I mean, really, you know, Eastwood's like this too, but Clint Eastwood's movies for the most part aren't usually, I think, as
epic.
Or as just maybe as technically challenging. That said, Sully, there was some pretty incredible, you know, effects works being done there to cheat that whole thing. Yeah. Then I know he worked really fast, and I thought that was probably one of his better movies.
I would love to work on an Eastwood set because I hear he just does like, he's done by 6 or 5 or every day.
Yeah, it's like 8 to 10 hour days. You know, it's almost time. Sometimes you're watching an Eastwood movie and you're like, you could have done another take. It's okay. It's all right to do another take. It's like, if you're an actor, you're like, if you didn't get in the first one, it's like, you might not get another chance. It's time to go home.
It's only a couple takes.
Yeah, I mean, he moves on, you know, it doesn't do a lot of coverage. And
Spielberg too, couple takes.
I mean, I think he'll do it till he has it. He just has the confidence to know when he has it. Right. Whereas I think a lot of, and I've seen a decent amount of other directors will not trust their instincts or not know what they're going to use, and so they'll overcover a scene not just in takes but also in angles, you know, and that's where it just becomes a real labor, you know.
What so now you're in documentaries, what I imagine you watch a lot of documentaries.
I got 2 young kids and I don't watch anything. Speaking of which, I'm probably gonna have to get home to these 2 young ones. My wife's like, "Where are you going? You're going to EJ's?" No, I mean, I do watch. I'm a fan of the doc series, especially has become an outlet that I love watching stuff. Whether it's like The Jinx or Making a Murder, you know, like these true. I found myself watching a lot of that stuff too, just to find like, you know, we do have a real fascination with some horrific stuff, right? We like true crime, murder, mysteries, and so it's like trying to understand why we like that stuff, but oftentimes don't want to know about massacres and things of these, like we want to remain ignorant to some of these harrowing things. It's like, why is that, is it, and what are the elements that maybe push audiences to that place where they just unplug or don't want to know. And so I have found myself watching a decent amount of that genre. Mm-hmm. Not that we were going to completely make that type of genre film, but I wanted to try to harness where we could those elements, because I felt like they were there. I felt like we had a mystery on our hands, and if we could use it in an authentic way, I wanted to, because I wanted to get people to watch a film they wouldn't otherwise maybe want to watch or think they would want to watch.
Well, you mentioned premiering a doc in Boston. Is that about the Boston Marathon?
Yeah. So we overseeing the Kennedy Marshall Documentary Division, we have a handful of projects in varying degrees. So this is a pretty incredible weekend for us. Finding Oscar just opened in New York at the Angelica Theater or Angelica Film Center yesterday, and is playing there for the week. And then it'll open in Los Angeles on the 21st and about 30 other cities over the course of the next few weeks.
That's great.
And this other documentary, it's called Boston. It's basically the history of the Boston Marathon.
Narrated by Matt Damon.
And it's marathon weekend. The Boston Marathon is on Monday.
Right. I know somebody that's running it.
Yeah, cool. And then there's a Fathom event. I don't know how quickly you get this thing put out there, but on Wednesday, the 19th, the Fathom events where they take over the different theaters. So in like 600 theaters, it'll get beamed across the country this Wednesday. Boston, yeah.
Boston, ooh.
Yeah.
I'd like to see that.
So if you want to go watch a bunch of people
I can't wait
do that unpleasant thing of running.
I know.
Talk about suffering.
I do have a connection with runners now. I do watch it and go, oh, I've done running.
Oh, I mean, I vicariously ran all over the world now. It's crazy. I've been involved with 3 of these things, with one in between. That I got a gig, editing another marathon documentary called Transcend because of running blind.
Yeah. From Kenya, right? It takes place in Kenya.
Starts in Kenya, yeah. But the guy ends up winning the Boston Marathon. So awesome. I've got a lot of history in the marathon world, and I've never even seen one of these things in person.
Time for you to get some sneakers,
or time for me to do a different type of movie.
Well, what are your goals? Do you want to stay with documentaries, or do you want to try again with the comedy and?
I love bringing the comedy chops, if I have any, to the doc space, because I feel like if you can make somebody laugh, if you can get that physiological reaction of laughter, then you've opened up an audience in a way that they're going to be more receptive to other things. If there is something that's sad, or if there is something that is emotive, to be able to balance it with humor, I find it so much more accessible to audiences, and maybe they also catches them off guard. So I would love just to make a comedy, or something that has a bit more levity in it than this story I'm just finishing. But I'm just attracted to a good story, and I didn't intend to be a documentarian, but I can appreciate that my aesthetic is one that enjoys things that are grounded in reality, whether it's based on a true story kind of movies, or movies like The Bourne Identity, where it's like, okay, it's an action movie as the helicopter goes overhead. And it's an action movie but it feels real. It's not, this guy isn't kicking ass because he was bit by a spider. You know what I mean? Like, there's no fantasy to this. This is like grounded in the real world that we live in. And I tend to like that kind of storytelling. And so it's not crazy, especially with a background in photojournalism, to, find myself making true stories in the documentary medium. But I also think the line is blurring between documentaries and films. Like, we're seeing a lot of films that feel more like documentaries, and we're seeing more documentaries that feel like films, where you're using tools in your narrative telling, tool belt and both of them. And so as somebody who aspired to be a narrative writer director, now making nonfiction, I like, blurring that line. And if there is something that comes along that's the right narrative project to be a part of, I would love to bring this experience to direct in that medium. But for the time being, like I'm doubling down on documentaries.
I felt like Finding Oscar could have been narrative.
Yeah.
Or could be.
I certainly wanted it to just feel like, it was a good story and not, but yeah, we'll see.
We'll see. All right. Well, hey, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, brother. I've been seeing all these impressive people grace this kitchen. It's nice to get in here.
Well, I'm glad to have you in here.
We'll have to go take a selfie, right? Is that next?
That's how it works. That's how it works.
Thanks, brother. It's so great to be here.
Thank you, Ryan.
All right.
Go see Finding Oscar and all of Ryan's stuff. Oh, do you want to plug a Twitter or anything or an Instagram?
Yeah, well, if you go to findingoscar.com, you can find all that stuff, or Finding Oscar DOC is the handle on Twitter and Facebook, and it'll be in theaters across the country already now in New York, but LA the 21st, and then quite a few after that in the weeks to come.
All right, great.
Thanks.
Well worth watching, so go check it out.
All right.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Well, there you go, folks. Thank you so much, Ryan, once again for coming out and talking with me in the kitchen. Sorry about all the noise distractions. Hopefully you were still able to enjoy listening to this podcast and interview. So go check out Finding Oscar, coming out April 21st. If you're listening to this after April 21st. Check your local listings. I don't know what that entails, but and see if it's playing. And if it's not playing, check out iTunes. Maybe it's on the iTunes. See if it's there. And while you're at it, go check out Running Blind on iTunes, Amazon, and Google Play. Again, my Twitter is @EJ Scott and @EJ Podcast. Instagram EJScott1106. My website is ejscott.com. And the charities are at crowdrise.com/7on7. And that's it. So go subscribe to my podcast on iTunes or iHeartRadio. And check out my past podcasts and my future ones. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.